Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. My name is Beth Davila Waldman, and I'm really pleased to be here this evening and see so many people out here today. Thanks for coming. I wanted to start by thanking the brand and thanking them for having our exhibition here. We're presenting Mapping the Sublime, Reframing Landscape in the 21st Century. And it's quite a pleasure, and especially it's been a joy to work with Shannon Curry. So thank you, it's been a true partnership. You know, about a year or more, fellow artist Larry Geit and I had an inspiring conversation, a choppy conversation, over a terrible Zoom connection when I was in Yosemite with my daughter. And 18 months later, here we all are. So it's been a pleasure to work with him and to co-curate Mapping the Sublime. Based on themes concurrent in both of our artistic practices, we work to build a broader foundation of exploring landscape in today's terms by drawing together this top-notch group of artists from Los Angeles, San Francisco, Berlin, and New York. We could not be prouder. I wanted to quote artist and panelist Constance Mallinson from her catalog essay for this exhibit. The artworks do not shy away from confronting future realities that result from climate change. Wars, hyper-surveillance, racial and ethnic tensions, and pollution, pandemics, and shortages. Acutely attuned to the fact that we have to coexist with the results of our behaviors, these artists are imaginatively mapping the way. So I want to thank all participating artists for trusting us and contributing to this project. Today, I'm so pleased to introduce you to the artists on the panel. So Guillermo Galindo is a post-Mexican experimental composer, sonic architect, performance artist, and visual media artist. His work redefines the conventional lines between music, the art of music composition, and the intersections between art disciplines, politics, humanitarian issues, spirituality, and social awareness. And his work, which encompasses at least 3 different series, involves video work and some beautiful flags that's in the middle back part of the gallery. And I also wanted to introduce Lawrence Geit, whose work employs the visual style of Manifest Destiny canvases of the 19th century as a reference to the Industrial Revolution, the historic origin of all our ecological peril. The image sources, however, are contemporary and based on screenshots of drone footage posted on the RT News service run by the Russian government. Constance Mallinson, she's presenting discarded objects that are collected from her daily walks through Los Angeles in our exhibition, Mapping the Sublime. And on them, she's painted disappearing wildlife and landscapes, such as Arctic glaciers and rainforests that have traditionally been subjects of much landscape art. A second work of hers is comprised of hundreds of crumpled, trashed landscape photographs of wild places crammed into a glass vitrine. She states, such artworks imply we are the perpetrators of the Earth's destruction. And Liz Miller-Kovacs, her work combines the exploration of materials and performative acts encompassing photography, sculpture, and video. Her studio practice is a search for meaning in a time when image eclipses reality, producing an increasingly inhospitable and toxic habitat reflecting upon the Anthropocene era and how it is changing our psychological and physiological condition. And Deborah and Andy Rappaport are bringing together 4 amazing video montages to our exhibition, and they're in the main media room in the center, the heart of the gallery space, so we're really excited. These 4 videos have been produced in collaboration with Deborah's hundreds of layered images of impacted natural environments, brought to life by Andy's riveting musical compositions. Deborah's vast source materials reflect her deep research into and unease with the proliferation of visual information in news media. Their video montages are an attempt to slow down the that rapid feed of information, and to give viewers the time and space to reflect upon the troubles in the world around us. Rappaport's complex sound design aims to create an auditory landscape that is both familiar and unsettled. We thank you so much for being here, and Constance, we wanted to especially thank you for writing the essay for our catalog. And now I'd love to introduce our moderator, Shayna Needs-Stambrot.
Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, and Larry, for asking me. Thank you to the artists who have agreed to unpack a very juicy couple of ideas in a relatively short amount of time today. The show is gorgeous. Congratulations to everyone involved. It's really beautiful. And that actually is kind of one of the places that I want to start. So just by way of a little introduction, for those of you who don't know, so I'm an art critic and sometimes curator based in LA. I'm the art editor of the LA Weekly. I write for a couple of other magazines as well, one of which is Flaunt Magazine, who just sent me to Venice, Italy, where I've been since last weekend during the preview week of the Venice Biennale. And yes, that's amazing. Yes, I'm a little jet lagged, but coffee is a miracle drug, so we're gonna be fine. But you know, it's so funny because I planned this, I agreed to this date, I don't know, some plural number of months ago. And then the Venice thing came up last minute, and it occurred to me that there's aspects to that that actually have a really salient role in some of the ways that we've been thinking about this. For one thing, if you're gonna think about climate catastrophe, Venice is a great place to do it. But in addition to that, one of the things that I let everybody know that we wanted to unpack a little further today, which I think is something that it really is operational and across the exhibition, is the relationship between a sort of message of, you know, a cautionary tale at best, a Cassandra-like catastrophe, DEFCON 10 warning at worst, and the production of beautiful, aesthetic, live-withable images and objects, and how that presents challenges in and of itself and definitely warrants more thinking about. And then I'm standing there in Venice, and aside from the Biennale, what's in there, what's in all these churches are some of the, not some of, but the most important, timeless objects in Western art history, many/most of which depict similarly catastrophic events, right? They're all the end times, from the flood in Genesis to the apocalypse at the end, you know, and everything in between. There's plague and pestilence and war and disease and famine and just on and on and on. And yet, if you think of like a paragon of beauty, you're gonna think of like a Titian painting, right? And so it occurred to me beautifully enough that this is actually a set of ideas that visual artists have been wrestling with for centuries. And so that was exciting, because I'm a big art history nerd. And then I'm coming back, and so that kind of is the conversation that I want to have with folks today. And I know that every one of the artists is going to have a different perspective and a different way that they balance these ideas in their practice. And so that kind of is the question I just want to ask everyone is, when, you know, and feel free to answer this with, you know, some backstory and some context as you see fit about your practice when I come to you. But this idea of, you know, why in what you do is it so important to address these issues, and then having once decided to be an artist who engages with these kinds of political, geopolitical, environmental, global scale, intimate scale kind of this relationship with this fraught time that we're in terms of the planet, and you've decided to engage with that as an artist, that you also presumably as an artist want to make, again, beautiful is not really the right word, because beauty is not always every artist's goal, but say, what is your relationship with aesthetic appeal? Do you want to make the work appealing so that people stay with it longer? Do you worry that that becomes disaster porn? Do you worry that if you're as honest and emotionally raw as you actually feel, that people won't be able to engage with the work as much as you would like because it's hard? Like, where on that continuum, and how do you kind of like deal with that in your practice? And that's kind of the question I just really have for everyone, and I can't wait to hear your answers. And then when we get past that, we'll talk a little bit, and I'm quite certain that people in this audience will have questions, and this is really more of a comment than a question, and etc. So there'll be time for that at the end. Whew, thank you for letting me get through that. I told you I'm a little over-caffeinated to combat the jet lag, so we're figuring it out. But that's most of what you're going to hear from me today. Now I really want to give up the time to hear from the artists. So thank you. And Liz, please start.
Oh, great.
I'm actually excited to start with you because your work is very seductive and yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of, I've given these questions a lot of thought. But, you know, I mean, I thought about the questions and I wanted to sort of articulate them well. You know, I have a list of the questions you asked, and I can answer them and elaborate on my answers. So, you know, as far as like the powers of art and its limitations, I mean, contemporaries are, the role of contemporary art in society is really to push the boundaries and to be a catalyst for change. And hopefully that's an evolution of society and a more compassionate, more aware society, and to, you know, evolve in so many ways and be more understanding and more compassionate towards each other and ourselves. I mean, this is the planet that we live on. People are like, oh, we need to care for the earth more. Well, we need to worry about ourselves because we're the ones that are going to be extinct. The earth is going to regenerate and there will be new species. So, you know, the limitation is we can provoke that thought, and we're going to speak to a certain audience. I don't think especially, you know, the mainstream audience might not necessarily have access to that, but art has always been, it's been an influence from our mainstream culture. So what happens to those ideas once it goes into mainstream culture, that is something we can't control. So it can just become sensationalized fashion, but hopefully, you know, there's enough sort of cultural influencers, for lack of a better term, that, you know, can try to get that across and
use their powers for good.
Yeah, use their powers for good, and sort of, you know, I mean, those of us who have been working with the dialect of art, which is its own language, you know, it's like for people who haven't studied that or aren't so interested in that. But hopefully the work can speak to everybody on some level, and that's part of the reason why I like to use seductive images and beautiful images. I do think it will stay with the viewer a lot longer, about contemplation. There's also a sense, I mean, I'm really seduced by the Anthropocene landscape. I was a sci-fi and fantasy fan growing up. I'm a big nerd.
It can provide a space for a non-commercial, if I can say that, certainly here at Korean. It's not tainted by commercialism in the way that so many landscape images are used by commercial interests. And so it gives us that space to think about, contemplate humanity. Yeah. And so that's what interests me so much. So it's, you know, it's my interest in painting, seeing that stay alive, seeing that stay part of the conversation of contemporary art. All these videos. You know, we use beauty. We use the way painting is revered. It's preserved in museums. So in a sense, painting for time immemorial has become a kind of record of human experience. Yeah. It's preserved, it's saved. And so in some ways, painting has had a unique advantage over a lot of other things in that we do value it as a handmade or a you know, very personal record of whatever that contemporary experience is.
Yeah, and I think there's something to be said for, you know, when we think of like, you know, you're in art history school, and, you know, by the way, anyway, most of what you're taught is Western art history, which I think just, you know, is always worth repeating, that when I say art history, that often is this kind of thoughtless shorthand for actually I'm talking about Western art history. So Western art history, you know, painting is the paragon, you know, the Patagonia, it's all that. But there is something to be gained from the conversation where an artist reaches back into that classic traditional skill set for a contemporary and subversive subject, and depicts it according to those same metrics that were applied to a different set of subjects traditionally. That there's something really interesting in that energy transfer there. But I definitely, you know, and I love everything you said, thank you for that, we'll definitely come back. But I definitely, before I forget, when you were asking that question, does the violence have to be grotesque? Does the moral have to be appealing? Liz, it made me think of you so much when she asked that. Because the way that you set up the violence and the beauty and the appeal and the repulsion in your images in the video is so like the answer to that question that I just wanted to give you a minute.
Well, I mean, the interesting thing, I was like kind of smiling to myself listening to the conversation because I started out as a painter and I did my first degree in painting, and right after undergrad school I started making paintings that were, I would take portions of old masters paintings, mostly landscapes, and I would incorporate images from, little enamel images of like iconography from advertising into those landscapes. So that's where I started from. So I was looking at so I have the color palette, that I learned color theory and paint and composition through that. So that's, I mean, I think it just carries through. I felt at one point that I wanted to challenge myself further and speak more to the actual media that was sort of corrupting our vision and our connection with nature, so I wanted to address that, be more confrontational, I guess.
And also, and just like Deborah said, when there's the thing where when you use photography, especially if it's, you know, straight photography, or, you know, borrowed from advertising sources, whatever it is, but when you're out there, you were saying, it's, you know, I went out there, that's my body, I was trespassing, that there's something to, that in its turn has its own energy of like, this is not a fantasy, this is up by the side of the road, anyone can see this because it's really happening, it's really real, I went there to prove it. And that has, so as much as like painting has the power of fantasy and poetry, photography has the power of reality. And so, you know, just different tracks.
Yeah, I mean, in my page here, like I wrote about, you know, the advent of photography really changing how, I mean, painting used to record the times that we lived in, whereas painting became a more bourgeoisie occupation and more decorative. It went into abstraction once because of photography, because photography could then record. You know, which is, I mean, if you've gone to art school, that's kind of our 101.
Right, they say
Luckily,
literally.
postmodernism came around.
Yeah, that's why postmodernism came around and basically.
Yeah, thank God for postmodernism.
But I mean, at the same time, you know, I mean, when you're talking about like consumerism, I mean, it's like when you step away from painting for a number of years, you miss being able to sell it because it's a lot easier to sell paintings as objects. You know, they are valued more, and I definitely, I mean, there have been times when I've really thought about going back to painting just for that reason.
I've got a siege of Damascus for you. Very low price.
But then we work with a kind of, you, Larry, merge photography and painting
Well, I was
tradition.
going to say, what happens when you paint a photograph
Right.
and you don't really change it all that much?
Or do you?
Or do you?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, when you decontextualize it and turn it into a 6 by 8 foot epic landscape painting.
That's very gentle and earthy and sort of evocatively vintage in its sepia-ness, so that it seems like it's gentle and then you realize what you're dealing with. Right, but that whole strategy that, you know, has come up in different ways with everyone today. You guys are amazing. Okay, so we started almost an hour ago, not quite an hour ago, 50 minutes ago, I know. So I want to give anyone up here for a shot at any comments burning a hole in your pockets, and then an audience. Oh.
I'll just say that I think, I mean, listening to everyone up here, that a lot of this, for all these artists, feels like trespassing. You know, I think you're really trying to show something in a way that people don't see or can't see, and point to it to make people reflect on it. Someone like Richard Moss, for instance, like Incoming, and that's a case where I think it is sort of grotesque and violent, and but there was distance. I mean, he was miles away when he was doing those photographs of what was happening. And there is not anything in the news that would ever give you any indication of. And as I said, as things become more abstract, you know, what is 7,000 people drowned off Libya, 80 million gallons of oil spilled, you know, how many people have died in Ukraine? You know, you just can't conceive of what that number is or what that feels like. And I think he, in that work, like absolutely all of those things, you know, too.
Yeah.
Like a lot of this work.
Yes, I think there's certainly a history of transgression in 20th century, 21st century art, and so there's certainly bits of that in what we do. One of the things that we didn't really touch on too much was, and you talked about balance, and balance for me is, and for all of us I think, is thinking about the formal aspects of art and art making and how it looks, not just aesthetics, but material engagement, those kinds of things, in new and interesting ways. And so I hoped that the styrofoam pieces would be transgressive in the sense that it's a painting which has a, you know, exalted place in the beauty pantheon. It's, you know, soon to be of value, and it's put on trash. So
Literally
it's kind of a
trash.
Duchampian gesture that I had hoped.
But you're also salvaging it from a landfill.
It's what?
The styrofoam in your piece will not wind up in a landfill.
True.
Well,
I don't know.
Well, hopefully, but that's the goal,
Ask my spouse.
right? I mean, hopefully a climate-controlled room at LACMA, not a
But
not a
still,
landfill.
you know,
But yeah.
there's a kind of a takedown of painting at the same time. So these also interest me and all of us at the same time. You know, how do we challenge our medium in the way that art, the avant-garde has always attempted to do? You know, how do we redo it? How do we question it? How do we, yeah. And, you know, the trashed landscape photos, I mean, there hasn't been any comment on that from photography people, but, you know, there's also a defilement going on in putting up a landscape photograph that's saying, or questioning, you know, you always were the record of the beautiful landscape, and now I'm destroying that.
Yeah.
So, you know, that plays into the idea of transgression and, you know, all of that, so.
Andy, you seem like you have something to
Well, I
say.
just, you know, on the theme of transgression and trespass, you know, there's, when you're making art that is innately political and the intention is to evoke a response, there's the trespass that Deborah mentioned, which is the appropriation of the content. You know, we're sort of voyeuristic in the sense of, you know, trying to grab this content. But then there's the other trespass, which I'm much more used to as a 50-year performing musician, which is the trespass of the audience's mind. And, you know, as a musician, you know, I only knew I was successful if I was allowed to trespass in your mind, because there was some resonance to something that I had composed or performed. And here, you know, I think we're not saying, okay, we're going to take all of this stuff and we're just going to put it out there and not be concerned about the conceptual aspect of how it resonates with the viewer, but to think very intentionally about, you know, taking the material that represents one form of trespass and transform it into another form of trespass where, you know, it just kind of invades and won't leave.
And that's success.
And that is success.
For work of art.
That's, you know, yeah, exactly.
Brilliant, I love it. Okay, yes.
Well, I was just thinking, we didn't really talk too much about the idea of like the didactic and really direct sort of how it alienates the audience, and I feel like this sort of circles back into that conversation, because, you know, the purpose of our contemporary art, especially the kind of art that we make, which is meant to initiate the conversation and contemplation of some of these issues. And I feel like, you know, when I was in art school, I was probably a generation a little bit after the people like, you know, like Barbara Kruger, who initiated this very like, okay, we're using the language as very directly political, you know, that first wave, and second, I guess there was the 60s and then the 80s, that sort of first wave of political art. And it seems like there's been a revisiting of that and a sort of a renewed popularity of that kind of work. And I don't know if it's just generational or partly because of the previous administration and the sort of conservative backlash. But I feel like, you know, when you make that kind of work, you're just preaching. It's like all the choir is like, the people that are already your supporters are right behind you, and it's going to alienate the people that you actually want to reach. So, you know, I feel that all the work that I've seen in this show, it is really beautiful and it's aesthetic, and I think that anybody can look at it and find it interesting and find value in it and take the time to, you know, contemplate what it's actually about. And
then they got the message before they even know.
And those of us who might not be trespassing in real life, we might be trying on Google Maps. I mean, how much, you know, or wherever you're finding it.
I love that.
I have one non-aesthetic comment.
Okay.
And sorry if you know me well, just patience with my rant, okay? So I want to come back, just circle back to one thing I was saying about the macro level rather than our micro strategies about aesthetics. I do think, in my humble opinion, that the art world is not a leader in environmental action. And I think art fairs are especially unsustainable events. I think museums like MoMA still harbor eco-criminals on their boards. I think some artists, and at least one gallery here in Los Angeles, has addressed the issue of the gigantic waste it takes to move art and show art. It's called Artists Commit. It's an artist-led collective committed to climate consciousness. It was launched last November. And they made a climate impact report for galleries, and Hauser Wirth, which has 14 branches around the world, which they shuttle work back and forth all the time. They produced close to 8,600 tons of CO2 just in 2019. That's 1,300 cars for a year. They have hired an environmentalist on their staff.
They have.
Because they can. And they have pledged to cut those emissions by 50% by 2030.
Wow.
Seems like weak sauce to me, but at least someone's talking about it. No other galleries seem to be talking about it.
Well, who's going to hold them accountable?
And who's going to hold them? It's a
Newsom.
self-accountable system.
Yeah.
So I'll just say this. I think as artists, and this is the Marxist-Leninist in me coming out, is we do control the means of production. And so if we decide not to do a 12-foot painting on metal for the Venice Biennale and build a crate for it and put it on a container ship and have a helicopter drop it in there and then put it back in the crate, make a new crate, put it back in the container ship. We have the power to say, well, I'm just going to do that on paper and roll it up in a tube. I had a show in Beijing in 2019. I filled a 4,000 square foot gallery with drawings that I took in a tube on the plane with me. Now, I had a carbon footprint, but the show had no carbon footprint. So I propose to you here, and this idea might die right in this room.
They all look pretty sad.
to have an event called Ecomenta, that's my pet name for it,
Oh, yeah.
which is completely data-driven, in a carbon-free zone, an in-person carbon-free art fair where the art is designed to be sent there without any carbon expended. Artists can make that choice, you know, and they have an international show and do something a little different, you know, something that doesn't take so much money and energy to send. So I'll leave you with that as a floating idea. If you want to talk about it after the show, I got lots of ideas.
Crypto finance.